If you live in Australia right now, you probably have one question on your mind. What on earth is the New South Wales government doing? Their response to the most recent COVID outbreak up there, the Delta strain no less, has been really, really weird. Not only did they have the index case and do nothing for nearly 9 days, their response after this, and it became clear that the outbreak was out of control, has been to slowly dribble in degrees of lockdown to the point where now, nearly 2 months later, they actually have a stage 4 lockdown, the level of lockdown that Victoria went to immediately with this most recent outbreak. So why on earth are they doing this? This is not a good response. And this is all the more weird considering that you had Victoria there as a case study from nearly exactly a year ago today. We had our second outbreak, our second lockdown around about this time in 2020, and we had a lot more uncertainty at the time as well. At the time, lockdowns were unsure. It was unclear whether or not they would work or not compared to a variety of different options, and naturally there was a lot of debate around it. But having come out of that lockdown and been successfully COVID-free for several months before subsequent outbreaks were again brought under control, you had the case study right there. Not only that, you can also see what happens with Victoria's case where you don't lock down fast enough and subsequently it gets out of control and you end up in lockdown for longer or with an overwhelmed health system. So what the hell is happening here? With that case study right there, New South Wales has still managed to bungle this to the point where they've managed to exceed Victoria's top score, as it were, last year. Now, it might be tempting at this point to say that New South Wales clearly just lacks sufficient power to control the situation, considering that power is, by definition, your ability to control the situation. Maybe they need more information, more technology, more authority, better ability to enforce the rules. Surely, if they can just centralize a little bit more power, they'll be able to bring this under control. And this is where the problem is. My work through Power and the Professional, my book on power dynamics, actually illustrates that this is the opposite of true. What is going on here is too much power. Let me illustrate. There are 3 perils of power identified through that book. And the first of these is that the more power you have, the less accountability you tend to be exposed to. And that probably sounds completely wrong, doesn't it, considering that the New South Wales is under quite a bit of criticism right now. But criticism is one thing. Accountability is entirely another. Right now, there is no means for anyone to stop the New South Wales government doing whatever it wants. You cannot compel them to change policy. Now, we have an election, sure, coming up in a couple of years, and that is in no way going to influence their decision-making right now. They've got 2 years to patch this up after the fact. In fact, it's a standard policy or a standard tactic for governments to do the unpopular stuff up front. When I'm talking about accountability, I mean passive and active accountability. And power allows you to remove both. Passively, by discouraging people around you from criticizing you. Politicians tend to surround themselves with people that are on their side, right? People that will back them up, core team members. How long do you think someone would last around Gladys Berejiklian if they were constantly criticizing her policy approaches? Probably not very long. This can also happen actively as well, whereby you proactively remove people from around you or disallow them access to you if they're likely to be critical of you, because it's not fun to be criticized. And we're seeing this in New South Wales with the journalists at Question Time being strongly encouraged not to ask critical questions. And when they do, they're shut up. The second peril of power here is that power enables irrationality. We all have cognitive biases, 188 known cognitive biases in psychological science. Goodness knows there's probably more that we haven't identified yet. You cannot eliminate these biases, but you can manage against them. And the best way of doing that is by surrounding yourself with people that are willing to offer alternative perspectives and call you out on your irrationalities. You may notice that the more power you have, and therefore the more influence you have over others, the less likely they are to actually do this. It allows you to surround yourself with yes people. And that is not going to do anything positive for your irrationality. This is particularly evident in New South Wales with the gold standard going on right now. Imagine this, you've gone through nearly 18 months of successfully defeating COVID in your state without a lockdown. Aren't you brilliant? The Prime Minister labels it the gold standard, and you're going to attach your ego to this. And then you have an outbreak that you can't get under control. Contact tracers get overwhelmed, and it's simply not going to be viable to do it anything other than lockdowns. At this point, everything you've invested into your pride, everything you've put on the line emotionally around that gold standard that you were very proud about, not to mention some of the crap you were talking about other states that did do lockdowns. At this point, you need to choose between your pride and reality. And we know how that played out. And we know how that plays out in far too many people. Everyone has biases, but they can be managed, but not with a concentration of power. And finally, the third peril of power is that, simply put, no one thinks they're the bad guy. The only people I've ever met that genuinely thought they were the bad guy were actually pretty decent people with terrible self-esteem. The reality is that no one wants to think that they are doing the wrong thing. And that is particularly going to be a problem when it comes to good decision-making, when your policy decisions have resulted in thousands of infections that didn't need to happen, including several deaths. And one child in hospital thus far. Imagine having to confront that. Yes, you made a mistake. Absolutely. Up front, perhaps you made a mistake, and perhaps that is understandable. But instead of confronting that situation and accepting the costs that you have inflicted on others, what's safer from a psychological perspective than just pretending you were right? The reality be damned. And so that need to protect your sense of self comes into direct conflict with good policy making. Now, here's the thing. All three of these perils, which we can see evident in New South Wales leadership over this most recent COVID outbreak, are not because of who they are. Gladys Berejiklian and the cohorts around her are not in any way evil, so to speak, or more prone to unethical behavior than anyone else would be in a leadership position. It's rather that they have such a strong concentration of power, including a very forgiving press and a supportive federal government, that these perils are allowed to fester and ruin their decision-making capacity. By contrast, consider Victoria this time last year and every outbreak since. Dan Andrews was in some trouble. Not only did he have an outbreak in Victoria that was running rampant, as well as no clear case study of how to manage it, he also had an extremely hostile press that was baying for his blood at every single moment. He also had a hostile federal government, and our closest neighbours were also hostile to us and gladly politically differentiating themselves from his current plight, saying, oh, well, we didn't have to lock down. In other words, he was under siege. Now, am I saying that Dan Andrews is a better leader inherently than Gladys Berejiklian? No, not in the slightest. What I'm saying is that this hostile environment, and thus significantly lower power concentration, is probably why we had good leadership. It wasn't a lack of power that makes or breaks a COVID response. It is rather a lack of accountability. And accountability is anathema to power concentration. So if you're looking at the current situation in New South Wales and asking why things are going so incredibly badly, please do not fall for the temptation of saying we need to hand them just a little bit more authority, give them a free pass, let it look the other way and give them the benefit of the doubt. People with power don't need the benefit of the doubt. They have power.